Okay, and start.
Okay. Well, good afternoon and thank you for joining us on the virtual open day. My name's Jill Offer and I'm the programme leader for the Applied Animal Science programme, and this afternoon I'm going to tell you a little bit about what we do on the Animal Science programme and the sort of things that we include, and basically some of the modules that we teach on the programme. So in the Southwest faculty, the Applied Animal Science programme is based down at the Barony Campus, which is in Southwest Scotland. It's on a lovely big estate, which is going to be home to the Dairy Research Centre. And alongside that, there are all sorts of other courses ongoing, not just the agricultural side of things, but the animal care, vet nursing, wildlife conservation. You can see the list here, a real wide number of different programs which happen in conjunction with the applied animal science. Now, the applied animal science that I'm going to tell you about is basically a top-up degree which runs from year 3 of the degree to year 4, and you can join the programme in a number of ways. Here you can see on this slide here, you will, if you study with SRUC Applied Animal Science, you'll end up with an honours degree awarded by the University of Glasgow. At the moment we articulate our degrees, we validate our degrees through the University of Glasgow, but we're aiming to have our own degree awarding powers very soon, but that's something for the future. So why look at animal science? Well, it's an increasingly popular thing to study. We've got a growing population, we've got all sorts of problems with things like climate change and biodiversity and that kind of thing. We need to be making sure that we can produce our livestock in a sustainable and humane manner. So we're not just looking at livestock on the programme, we're also looking at companion animals, and we'll also look at the wildlife side of things as well, particularly with respect to welfare standards, biodiversity and controlling diseases in our livestock, companion animals and other animals as well. So there are 2 ways that you can join the programme. You can either join in first year, in which case we aim to offer a bespoke bioscience HNC, HND programme for years 1 and 2. They're through the SQA, Scottish Qualifications Authority. So you could, if you decided that you didn't like it after 2 years, if you joined in year 1, you could leave with an HND. Alternatively, you could stay with us with your HND and start year 3 of the Applied Animal Science programme. Now, it's not just the bioscience, the applied bioscience that will articulate onto our programme, but also anybody with a suitable HND in things like animal care and that kind of thing, with a good animal background, can be considered for articulation onto our programme. So we have recently revalidated the programme and revamped a lot of the modules that we offer. Here you can see the list of modules which you would be expected to study in the for your honours degree in applied animal science. Year 3, all of these modules are mandatory, none of them are optional, so there are 8 modules that you'd look at, and I'm going to go through those shortly, tell you a little bit more about things like the strategic animal nutrition, the epidemiology, and the other courses that we have on the programme. In year 4, you will study 5 modules and your honours project, which I will tell you about towards the end of this talk, which is basically your own little piece of research, which you will then write up as a dissertation and give presentations on. So you'll see there are actually 6 modules there. Well, it's the applied animal nutrition and the animal welfare assessment, which are electives on that course. So you would pick one of those. The breeding and genetics, disease surveillance and control, animals at the centres of global issues, and animals and climate change are mandatory modules which you would study. But nevertheless, they are very interesting, and a lot of the modules that we are teaching here are actually led by researchers, so people who are actually carrying out real current research, so you're really up to the minute in respect to the information which you're being given on the modules. So cutting edge science from the basically world experts in these different areas. So with the early life physiology, we're looking at reproductive strategies of mammals, internal, external fertilization, biological fitness, and reproductive strategies to increase things like, your biological fitness, looking at gestation length, looking at factors that affect it, and the physiological controls. And then we also look at some of the physiological strategies for nourishment of offspring and lactation. So how do we manage the lactation of animals and the feeding of our young stock, and how does that basically affect them? It's not just mammals that we're looking at with respect to this, but we'll also look at a wide range of animals, including monotremes and pinnipeds and all sorts of different types of animals. And we're looking basically in this module, we're looking from fertilization right the way through to weaning. So the final part of this one is to look at the late pregnancy and the weaning, and look at how we can manipulate the diet for the composition of the milk and how that affects the way that our animals grow. Now the next one is probably one of my more favoured modules. It's one which I teach on to because I have a nutrition background, and in this we're looking at how the way that we feed animals relates to their health, relates to their welfare, and the effect that that also has on the environment. Now within this we're looking at the nutrition and how that affects the gut microbiome. We're all well aware of the trillions of bacteria which are associated with our guts and can influence our health and our well-being. Well, it's exactly the same with the animals. We also need to think about what we're feeding the animals. Okay, we might not be feeding animal protein anymore as a result of BSE and the banning of feeding things like fish meal and meat and bone meal, which was finished years and years ago now. But we've replaced that with feeding things like soya, which has quite a large environmental footprint. So we need to be thinking about that. So we're thinking about, can we grow more environmentally friendly protein sources to feed to our livestock in the UK, and how does that affect the animal and their productivity and their health? So we're also looking at how nutrition affects the health of the animal. So things like with the direct and indirect effects of nutrition on pathogen load and their sensitivity to gastrointestinal parasitism and that kind of thing. Looking at the role of protein nutrition on peri-weaning gut health. Lots of different ins and outs of all this to look at. And then finally, we're looking at the effects of nutrition on behaviour and welfare. Now, maybe you are aware, maybe you're not aware that what we can eat will affect our behaviour. I mean, you've only got to look at the sort of well-known effect of blue Smarties on kids, making them as high as kites with the sugar rush that they get. Well, it's not exactly the same, but there are similarities with the way that we feed our livestock. The way that we feed our animals can affect their behaviour and can influence their welfare. So that's something that we need to be looking at. So looking at the role of fibre in the diet, the way that affects feeding behaviour, fatty acids and brain development, the effect of different amino acids on animal behaviour. Lots and lots of really interesting things to look at with respect to that module. And then the next one, something which everybody nowadays will be experts in, since we've had this coronavirus, we're all well aware of a lot of the ways that we study disease in a population level. But it's exactly the same with our livestock. We need to be able to first of all diagnose the disease. We need to look at the patterns of disease in the populations and study the relationship between the population structure and animal health. So we're going to describe different types of diagnostics available for infectious and non-infectious diseases. We'll look at the strengths and limitations of different diagnostic methods, such as sensitivity and specificity. So do we get false negatives? Do we get false positives? What effect does this have on the way that we look at the pattern of the disease? And then we're looking at some of the quantitative tools that we can use to look at epidemiological patterns. So do a little bit of modelling, as it were, seeing how epidemiological models can capture key processes which affect disease dynamics and that kind of thing. So quite an in-depth look at modelling of disease. So very interesting, though, I'm sure you'll agree. Right, well, the next one that we're looking at is animal welfare concepts. And basically, this is an introduction, first of all, to the history of the interest in animal welfare, looking at animal welfare frameworks, so the 5 freedoms, the naturalness, the biological functioning, effective states, all sorts of different ways of looking at animal welfare, definitions of animal welfare and modern perspectives on the assessment of welfare. So lots of ways, how do we look at welfare? What does it actually mean? Well, one of the things we can look at is how these animals are actually coping with their environment. I mean, looking at these 2 pictures here, you might say, well, these cattle here have got, they've got no bedding, they're sat on a hard floor. But are they unhappy? Are they coping with their environment? They look relatively clean, they look well fed, they look quite content. I don't know. What is their welfare? And these are some of the questions that we have. Likewise, you could look at these birds out in the field. OK, you can say, well, they've got the freedom to roam where they want to do, but actually they're all huddled under the shade there, trying to get out of the heat. So maybe their welfare isn't as good as something which has been housed. So, you know, all sorts of things to think about there. So we'll also look at a little bit about animal sentience and look at the scientific knowledge of animal sentience and the link with animal welfare. We're looking at affective states, so concepts of things like stress, pain, fear, and positive affective states. We look at all sorts of different concepts. The concept, for example, of a good death. When is it time to say goodbye to some of your companion animals? Should we be hanging on to them? Is that fair? All sorts of interesting debates to be had in that module. The next one we're looking at is advanced physiology of growth and development. Now, in the early life and growth of animals, we looked, in the previous module, we looked at basically fertilization to weaning. Well, in this instance, we're starting to look at what happens once we wean the animals through their adolescence then and through to maturity. So we're looking at things like tissue deposition, mobilization and repletion of tissues, physiology of tissue deposition, all sorts of different things. So how we can basically affect body composition, how we can manipulate meat, milk, body conformation. Should we be aiming to do these things? Understanding some of the seasonal patterns and the environmental triggers behind what causes animals to grow. And quite an interesting way to sort of look at the physiological processes involved in trait modification and current and future concepts, including biotech-mediated growth modifications. So lots of interesting things to think about with that module. So one of the next ones we're looking at is the wildlife and agriculture interactions. Now, this is really a topical module to have a look at, because we're looking here at the relationship between wildlife and agriculture. Now, obviously, there are sometimes conflicts between wildlife and agriculture. you know, things like disease reservoirs and habitat encroachment, but there's also positive influences of wildlife on agriculture, so things like key pollinators. So we're looking at, equally, we're looking at the effect of agriculture on wildlife. So the pros and cons of each, how we can change our agricultural management strategies to positively affect this relationship with wildlife. What sort of things should we be doing, the way we farm our land, the way we look after things? How should we be enhancing biodiversity and conservation of different species of animals, or should we? So some interesting concepts to think about with respect to that one. Now this one might not sort of jump off the page and you might not think, well, how interesting is that? But the advanced research methods is a really valuable module which starts to introduce you to some of the use of statistics. So it tells you basically a range of different ways that we can design experiments and how to ask the right questions so that you're going to get an answer at the end of the day, and how to interpret that data, the answer that you get, and then more importantly, how to communicate that to the audience that you've got to speak to. It's no good doing a lot of scientific procedures if you can't then tell people what that actually means. And that's something which is going to be really, really useful when you come to the next year and you're doing your honours project and you've got your own data to have a look at. You need to be interpreting that and saying what that actually means. So quite a key module, that one. And then the final one that I want to look at for year 3 is a new module to the programme, which when we revalidated the programme a couple of years ago now, we asked the students what they thought would be a useful addition to the Applied Animal Science programme, and they said we want a bit more on careers. So what we can do with our animal science career. So we're looking specifically in this module about how animal science is used by society and how that can translate into different career paths for animal science graduates. Now here you can see some pictures that we've taken of past students where they've been actually out on a study tour. Now, obviously with COVID, we've not been able to get students out and about on study tours, but we've had some really, really interesting talks, particularly by some of the past students who've studied applied animal science and now are out in industry working with, for example, some of the labs, maybe working, doing their own PhD, maybe they're working in the feeding companies or some animal breeding companies, and they come back and tell us what it's like, tell us the good bits and the bad bits, what it's actually like doing an animal science career day to day, and that's been very helpful for the students, helping them to decide where they might go after they graduate. So they're the mandatory modules that we're looking at in year 3. And then moving on to year 4, like I said, the animal nutrition and the animal welfare assessment are, in these instances, elective, so you pick one of those. You get a grade which is carried forward from your year 3, which forms basically a 9th of your total grade that you get for year 4. So you're studying 5 of these modules. You get your grade from year 3 brought forward, and your honours project is worth basically 3/8 of your year 4. But I'll tell you a little bit more about that as we go through. So looking at animal welfare assessment, we're looking at how do we actually measure welfare, and is it relevant to use these different methodologies? How do we interpret the animal welfare assessment that we've actually done? So there's all sorts of interesting things. Maybe you've heard of Professor Françoise Wemmelsfelder. She's doing the qualitative behavioural assessment, where basically you're just asking people, do you think those animals have good welfare? Do you think they look happy animals? Do they look stressed? Do they look this, that and the other? And asking, then basically interpreting the human assessment of it Now, you might argue that that's just being anthropomorphic and it's not something that we should be counting, but it's proving to be a very valuable way of actually assessing welfare. Now, obviously, you need quite a lot of people to do that, to get you some kind of valid assessment on it. So it's not always that easy if you're wanting just to go and assess, say, for example, a particular dairy herd like Frith Langford is here, looking at what I think she's looking at how close she can get to cows as a way of assessing their welfare. Obviously, if they've been badly handled, they would be frightened of her and they'd be running away off the field much more quickly. So, you could argue that the human approach there is an assessment of welfare. So anyway, lots and lots of different ways of looking at welfare. The disease surveillance and control. This basically leads on from the epidemiology module, which you studied in year 3. And we're looking at monitoring disease and how we check disease levels, looking at different interventions and how we can control diseases. It's really important. For example, at the end of the foot and mouth outbreak 20 years ago, they were looking at the data. And then they can look back and say, well, should we have vaccinated against foot and mouth? Should we have been using the contiguous cull? Was that worth it? And it helps to validate your strategy the next time we get an epidemic hitting the animal population. So management strategies for disease control, really, really important. Okay, the next one, the applied animal nutrition. This is very much the applied end of the nutrition. We're looking at some of the different rationing systems which are used not just for our livestock, which obviously farmers are very keen to have a good ration and make sure that it's good value for money, but also for our companion animals like this hungry horse here, and for our cats and dogs and that kind of thing. Looking at different and alternative feeds, taking further that concept which we had with the strategic animal nutrition. Should we be looking at more environmentally friendly ways of feeding our animals? And how do we get all that information across to our animal owners and keepers? How do we transfer that knowledge? I think there are issues, for example, with the horse side of things. A lot of people don't recognise when their horse is actually overweight, and therefore that contributes towards basically overfeeding the animal and obesity and animals being overweight. About half of them are overweight at any given time. So interesting things to think about with that one. And then we're moving on to animals at the centre of global issues. How does animal science address some of the global issues that are being faced? So the obvious ones that you can think about here are things like looking at methane emissions. How do we feed our animals? How do we breed our animals to minimise things like methane emissions and minimise global warming? That's just one of the societal issues which we face, but there's lots and lots of new developments as they come along, and this module is aimed to have a look at some of those as we go through. Okay, and then the next one, we've got a very big genetics department within SRUC who've done a lot of genetic evaluation and developed a lot of programs which are used in breeding and selection of livestock particularly. There are a lot of expertise in some of the molecular genetics and genomics in genetic improvement, and we'll be going through some of that there. So obviously there's the ethical side of this to look at. It's not just livestock that we'll be looking at, so we're looking also at our companion animals as well. So the ethics of genetic improvement is a big one to be thinking about there. And then the final module that I need to talk about is the animals and climate change, contributions and consequences. So the impact of climate change on animals and the contribution that animals make to climate change. So if, for example, the planet does warm up, will there be places where we can't keep animals anymore because it's too hot or it's too cold? How does that affect food security across the world? You know, if we can't keep animals in different areas, then can we produce animal protein there, or is it going to have to be produced somewhere else? Lots of things to think about with that one. So again, this is one of these modules which will change as time goes on because the issues change continually. Obviously, the impacts of animals on climate change, and there are several well-known impacts. And again, we're back to the methane emissions and that kind of thing, and the environmental pollution associated with some of our activities with respect to animals, which can affect the environment. Okay, so then with your honours project, this is basically worth effectively 3 of the modules. So right at the beginning of the year, the 4th year, you'll decide what it is you want to look at. Now, if you've got some particular area that you're really interested in, then yes, you can carry out your own study if you can design a study which is actually going to prove something at the end of the day. And also if it fits in with our ethical approval processes. You can't just decide that you want to study pulling the wings off a fly, because you wouldn't get that through the ethics committees. It's got to be something which is done for a purpose and is done in a humane manner. So what you'll do is you'll look at data from other studies, you'll look at the background to your work, you'll use all that information that you've looked at to basically design your study. Frequently what you will do is to borrow data from ongoing research within SRUC, so you'll work alongside one of the researchers and basically look at some of their data, maybe from a different angle, asking different questions of it. But they will help you designing your study, and this is where your experimental design and your advanced research methods program comes into being. So you'll decide what you want to look at. You'll actually go ahead and do your observations. So it could be that you're observing some behaviour or something, or you could be doing something in a lab somewhere. But basically you're recording your results, and then comes the data crunching. You'll do your analysis. Did it work? Didn't it work? Why didn't it work? Why did it work? What do the results look like? And then you'll have a presentation. You'll stand up and give a presentation on it once you've decided on your results, and you'll write your dissertation. And then, all being well, you will graduate. But one of the main things that you need to do if you want to study applied animal science is to be curious about things. What makes animals tick? Why are they so nosy? Why do they do this? How can we make things better for them? How can we make our contribution to animal science count more? You know, what sort of things do we need to be studying? All sorts of different questions to be looking at, but the most important thing that you can do is to stay curious, like this little elf program having a pony having a good sniff at the camera there. That's his name, is Elf. Okay, I'm going to finish at that now. If there's any questions, please just let me know.
Hi Jill, we had a couple of questions about joining from straight from school with hires onto the programme.
Yeah, well, you can join into the HNC. We will be offering a bioscience, a stream of bioscience, which will equip you for getting into the programme. So I would have to check what the entry requirements are, but I think it's 2 Bs that you need for. Yeah,
hires
it, isn't it? Yeah, hires. Yeah.
With wind science.
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah, so yeah, we can do that by all means, or you could go into animal care and articulate onto the programme that way. But yes, we will do the bioscience. That's something which we're aiming to offer this year, and that's basically got sort of basic science in it. A bit of nutrition, starting out on welfare, starting out on animal physiology, 101 different things. Again, with the bioscience, I think there's about 15 modules in each year, so I haven't got the list of those just to my fingertips, but there's a range of different modules which basically equip you for going into the 3rd year and for studying the Applied Animal Science programme. Does that help answer the question, or are we still?
Yep. Nope, that's great. And if anybody wants more information, they can reply to the email that was sent out, and we're happy to.
Yeah, sure.
That's lovely. Great. Thanks, Jill.
Okay.